very much another Bitcoiner who's found that the way to making this a successful network, the way to driving adoption, and the way to financial freedom is through education. So I'm very, very happy to welcome here Seb to take it over. Give it up.
So, initially, when Tristan, the founder of kind of Learning Bitcoin, reached out to me, he was just like, Seb, do you want to speak at the Unconference? And I was like, man, I usually speak to non-Bitcoiners. Like, I really like trying to distill down complex Bitcoin ideas into their simplest form and speak to the layperson. And so I was a little lost as to what do I speak about if I'm speaking to Bitcoiners? I'm not really used to speaking to Bitcoiners. And in the end, what I'm really passionate about is how do we show up authentically? And I think part of showing up authentically is leaning into curiosity, leaning into learning, leaning into being the best version of ourselves. And so I thought I'd put together a little slide deck around kind of why learning is key to an abundant future. And you guys probably notice I stole this name from Jeff Booth, why deflation is key to an abundant future. But to me, I very much believe that although deflation is key, we've got to be able to learn. We've got to be able to understand the world around us, make sense of the world around us, and be curious. So I want to kind of dive into why learning is key, how we can how Bitcoin supports an environment where we can learn, and what Bitcoin has done to me as an individual and supported me in my learning endeavors. So to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mao. And this is not my area of expertise, and so I'm going to use Roger as my fact checker. So Roger, call me out if I'm incorrect in anything I say. But essentially, if you ever dive into the history of Mao, and for those who aren't familiar with Mao, Mao kind of led this thing called the Great Leap Forward in China. And it was kind of one of the biggest major kind of genocides that ever happened in history. 30 to kind of 60 million people died. And one of the biggest threats Mao kind of came up against was intellectuals. He was threatened by knowledge. He was threatened by people that were curious. He was threatened by those that are willing to kind of forge their own path. And so these individuals in these pictures are the intellectuals, they're the academics, they're the scholars. And so Mao actively went to target these academic institutions. He burned a lot of the books, he burned a lot of the knowledge bases, so people weren't able to necessarily dig in to be able to figure out what is truth and to be able to forge their own path. They ended up kind of getting stuck in the thought reform that Mao was pushing. People weren't able to see what was really happening. And one of the famous quotes that Mao ended up saying was, the first emperor only buried 460 scholars alive, while we've buried 46,000. I once debated with the people of the Democratic parties. You accuse us of acting like the first emperor, but you're wrong. We've outdone him 100 times over. And so what this is really highlighting is that this was intentional. He recognized his threat was knowledge. His threat was people that were curious, they wanted to learn. And so in my mind, what I very much believe is that the first casualty of a totalitarian, a controlling society is always independent thought. If you strip away the capacity to question, you clear a path for control. If you dig into a lot of these totalitarian structures, which is what we're going to do in a moment, you start to realize that many times people don't have the capacity to think for themselves. They don't have the capacity to show up. Ultimately, they're just trying to survive. And so this kind of slide deck, what I really want to highlight, I'm standing in front of it, what I really want to highlight is kind of three main points. Why does fiat lead to totalitarianism? The second point is, how does Bitcoin, through abundance, disrupt this cycle? And then finally, we're going to dive into how do we turn this abundance into action? And of course, let's start with the first one. So there's a book that profoundly changed my understanding of these controlling structures. It came out at the very start of the pandemic, and that book is called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. It's written by a guy called Professor Desmet, who is the professor of psychology at Ghent University, and is kind of like the foremost expert in totalitarianism, looking at all of these structures, whether it has been Stalin, the Kim family in North Korea, whether it is Mao. And what he realized when he was studying these structures is there's essentially 4 stages that he has seen in all of these structures. Now, the first stage of any of these controlling structures is throughout society, once loneliness, the first domino to fall, once loneliness starts to become widespread, this is kind of like stage 1. People are stuck, they're just working, they're focused on surviving, and they don't have the capacity to show up, spend time with their friends, to spend time with their family. They're basically stuck on this hamster wheel. And loneliness is kind of that foundational pillar. Once it falls, the kind of the stage has been set, and totalitarianism, we start to see kind of like the what's the word? The seeds starting to be sown. We then get into stage 2, and that is meaninglessness. And I think that once you've got loneliness and then tied in with meaninglessness, if you're trying to save for a house and you think it's going to take you 10 years, and then you get 5 years in and all of a sudden, oh no, it's going to take me 20 years. It's really easy for meaninglessness to start to step in when people don't feel like they have much autonomy over their trajectory. They don't feel like they're going to be able to thrive, to be able to raise a family. All of a sudden, meaninglessness kicks in, and it's really easy for that depression, that frustration, that anxiety to kind of really start to weigh down on that individual. So the first stage is loneliness. The second stage is meaninglessness. The third stage is free-floating anxiety. Now, this is very different than fixed anxiety. If I'm standing next to the chief in Squamish, so a 600-meter cliff, and I'm anxious, understandably I'm anxious. I'm standing next to a 600-meter cliff. This is fixed anxiety. I know why I'm anxious. Free-floating anxiety, on the other hand, is when people are feeling this sense of frustration, this kind of welling up inside of them, this anxiousness, but they don't quite understand why they're feeling it. They don't have anything to attach it to. So now you've got a society that has got loneliness, meaninglessness. They're feeling anxious all the time. They can't quite kind of put their finger on it. And then finally, this kind of leads to aggression and frustration. When you have a society that is really facing all of these 3 states, you start to see this aggression and frustration, this social fracturing, where people, they start to lash out on one another. You start to see rising crime. You start to see social unrest. The social fabric of society starts to break down. And there are countless psychological studies done on things like rats, where if you're probing a rat and you're frustrating that rat will start lashing out on its peers, even if the peers are not the result of that frustration. And you see this in society today. People are short-tempered, they're frustrated, they've got a short fuse, and they're lashing out even when it is their friends and family that are not the result of those things. And this is, I very much believe, we're in the state in society where we've got loneliness, meaninglessness, free-floating anxiety, aggression and frustration. But I would say that what Professor Desmet is lacking in these 4 stages, and I talk about this in my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, there's one stage, and it's a preliminary stage. And that stage is money. I think that when you have sound money, you have a way to store value, where you have a way to be able to show up authentically, all of a sudden, you kind of inhibit these other stages from appearing. That's not to say that you won't have periods of loneliness. There's not to say that some people in society won't find meaninglessness. But if you have a way to store value into the future, you have a way to kind of build prosperity, maybe think about hope. If you're thinking about buying a house, and instead of it taking 10 years, it takes 5 years because you're saving in Bitcoin, it's much harder for these earlier stages to set in. And so I would argue that stage 0, money, is kind of the foundational pillar to these totalitarian structures. And then what you find is once all these stages are in motion, if a leader comes out and he manages to attach that anxiety, that free-floating anxiety to an object, all of a sudden this is where you get mass formation. People are willing to drop their inhibitions, they're willing to drop their morals, their values, and they target that object of anxiety. And so in North Korea, that was capitalism. Capitalism was why all of the bad things were happening in North Korea. With Mao, we saw it with the intellectuals. Stalin, we saw it with the farmers. You're willing to be able to use this mob mentality, regardless of the truth, and direct that energy towards these individuals. And then the problem with totalitarianism is it breaks down because it eats itself, because it's always built, it feeds on fear. But money, I think, is so foundational to these structures. If you've got broken money, that is what leads to these controlling structures. And so in my mind, the way I think about it is the more unstable the currency, the more of a mind share it consumes. If your purchasing power is diminishing, our concentration is focused on survival as opposed to thriving. We're not able to focus on family and hobbies, our career. We're simply focusing on how do I get food on the table so I can put a roof over our head. Sorry, choked on myself for a second. And so in my mind, fiat is the mental, kind of creates this mental tax of inflation. It's just constantly consuming our ability to show up. And what's also interesting is when we talk about these totalitarian structures, is when money starts to break down, you also have the issue where people become reliant on government. In the UK, over half of all UK citizens receive more in benefits than they pay in taxes. And the problem with this is that you then have this environment where the majority are always going to vote for more and more intervention. And so it's very hard to get out of this trend of totalitarianism, these control structures, when you have a society that is dependent on more and more intervention. And so, again, this is a result of money. When people are struggling to show up themselves, they're reliant on these handouts. And so, in my mind, and I've said this like 5 times, I'm just going to keep saying in my mind, fiat is the inhibitor to independent thought. Inflation slowly decays our ability to think for ourselves as we're focused on survival. We put off decision-making onto others. The more money decays, the less capacity we have. The less capacity we have, the less we're able to support others in our community, our family, ourself. And money is that foundational pillar. So we've kind of discussed, like, how does fiat lead to totalitarianism? Which then brings us to the next stage. How does Bitcoin, through abundance, disrupt this cycle? And this section I'm going to kind of skim through because you guys are deep down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin already. And I want to get to the learning section. But to highlight why Bitcoin is such a potent tool for totalitarianism, really, Bitcoin is the best savings vehicle we have. Everything in Bitcoin, what people want today in Bitcoin, costs less tomorrow. And so given that you've got this thing that is appreciating faster than everything else, you can flip that on its head and say everything is falling in relation to Bitcoin. So if you want to go and purchase a house, or you want to go and purchase food, or you want to go and purchase other assets, everything gets cheaper over time in Bitcoin. So life starts to get easier. Bitcoin is the apex savings tool. And that means that you've got more capacity. If things are getting cheaper, man, you can start to think, you can start to breathe again. And we see this in Canada. In Canada, in 2014, the average house cost $402,000. That was 1,054 Bitcoin. By 2025, that same house had risen to 717,000, but in Bitcoin, it had dropped to 8. So we've seen a 99% drop in house prices in Bitcoin, while house prices in fiat almost doubled. And so that gives people hope again. As I mentioned earlier, if you're trying to save for a house and you think it's going to take you 10 years, and then 5 years in you realize it's going to take you 20, it's really easy for that frustration, that meaninglessness to step in. But the opposite is also true. If you think it's going to take you 20 years and all of a sudden it takes you 10 years, oh my God, the amount of energy you get, that feeling of kind of relief, that feeling of hope, kind of really helps kind of supercharge your trajectory. So we were talking about the mental tax of inflation. But I think when we start saving in Bitcoin, when we start saving in this thing that appreciates over time, in my mind, it is the abundance unlock. And the abundance unlock, I kind of tend to look at it from 3 different perspectives. The first one is capacity. Bitcoin's rising purchasing power gives people breathing room beyond survival. As we start to increase our purchasing power, that breathing room allows us to focus on what's important to us. But not only that, it allows us to start to lean in and think like, you know what? How do I want to show up? What is it that I actually value? What is it that is meaningful to me? Do I want to spend more time with my family? Do I want to spend more time doing hobbies, starting a podcast? I just have more capacity to show up more authentically, which then leads us to the next stage, which is kind of curiosity. And I think that when we have more capacity, we can be more curious. When we're more curious, we can start diving into more subjects. Rather than just looking at the CBC News, we can start to look at different news sources. We can start to read books. We can start to watch documentaries. And as we start to consume knowledge from different sources, we start to get a broader understanding of the world around us. And that ultimately leads us, as we start to get a more broader understanding of the world around us, these inquisitive minds are less susceptible to manipulation. We can be more critical about the information which we're consuming. And I think the challenge today is that as people are facing all of these monetary pressures and they're struggling to be able to survive, the ultimate kind of like conclusion to that is that people tend to have limited ability to really lean in and critically think about the information they're consuming. So it's very easy for a society to fall into these controlling structures. Whereas Bitcoin, it really is an abundance unlock. When purchasing power increases, we have more capacity to show up authentically. And so while fiat demands our attention, Bitcoin returns it. I think Bitcoin gives us more capacity to think about what it is that we're consuming, and that is a threat to these controlling structures. If you have a whole society that thinks for themselves, that is able to interrogate the information they're consuming, that is a very hard society to control. That's an unbelievably hard society to control. And what I find is so amazing about coming to these Bitcoin events is, although in many ways we have very similar values in how we approach life, you can also meet people that have very different opinions, but you can actually have a discussion about them. As opposed to these kind of polarized topics that we see in society today, you bring up a topic and it's just shut down. You can't talk about those things. And so I love the fact that we have a curious environment where we can actually interrogate ideas. But most importantly, I think, this kind of, to summarize kind of the Bitcoin section, it's kind of like Bitcoin is the antidote to totalitarianism, as it gives us back the capacity to think for ourselves. However, that capacity is only great if we're using our minds like we're using our money, which is intentionally. We can still save in Bitcoin and increase our wealth, increase our capacity, but if we're still just kind of burning our time and watching the same news over and over again, we're still susceptible to the controlling forces. And so I kind of want to dive in next into some of the areas which have helped me as I've gone down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin, maybe think more about the information I'm consuming, some of the tips that have helped me immeasurably, and then ultimately I want to kind of put it on you guys for the last kind of 10 minutes and to see, one, if you guys have any questions, but two, how you guys also show up in life, think about the consumption of information. So let's dive into how do we turn this abundance, given that we've had more capacity, into action. So I think most importantly, it's kind of this idea of learn about learning. Learn about how we digest information, how do we consume information effectively. And you guys have probably seen this little meme. I've kind of broken it up into pieces. You've kind of got the Fiat smooth brain, the mouth breather. These individuals, I think they're struggling. I think they can't get enough oxygen. And many times they can't think about the information they're consuming. They're simply just surviving. And these individuals are very susceptible to manipulation and coercion. You then end up getting kind of the entry into Bitcoin. And as you get this entry into Bitcoin and you just start saving into Bitcoin, you start thinking a little more about like, man, how do I learn more effectively? And you learn about like neural pathways and how the brain works. You learn that repetition works. You start to think more about kind of the modalities of learning. And then it kind of leads to the next stage as that Bitcoin you purchase starts appreciating and you start to have more capacity. And you have more time to think about, how do I learn as an individual? Maybe I want to think more about like what kind of tools can I do? How do I support kind of my local habits? How do I get into meditation? How do I support myself in learning? And that ultimately leads me to, how do I create the environment for learning? And this is where once Bitcoin is appreciated, you start to create this environment where you're thinking about your sleep hygiene, where you're thinking about your access to light, getting out of these fluorescent lights, which are heinous on the eyes, getting out into nature, getting out into thinking about nutrition, the food we're consuming, as opposed to just constantly eating seed oils and garbage. And ultimately, I think what Bitcoin does is it creates space, and space allows for boredom. And boredom is actually phenomenal. I think in the world we have today, we've got so much stimulus that none of us are ever bored, but it is through boredom that we start to ponder and we start to contemplate and we think about the world around us, and that's where ideas are born. And so I think what Bitcoin does is actually allows us to create an environment, whether it's the light, whether it's the nutrition, whether it's the house that we live in, whether it's the ability to have space, to be able to lean into curiosity. And so these kind of four environments kind of moving through them, I've noticed along my journey there's been a few tools and environments that have helped me immeasurably. And so I'm going to share 3 of them, and then I'm going to turn it back on you guys. So the first one that's helped me unbelievably is finding your happy place. I live in Squamish, so like 45 minutes an hour from here, and there are countless studies which have supported this. And this is before I dug into the studies. I realized that if I'm walking through the forest, if I'm by a stream, I just feel so much more grounded, and I feel like I'm able to absorb information at a far deeper level than when I'm in the city or when I'm around stimulus. And there's many psychological studies. This one in particular, you don't have to understand what the chart is showing, but what it's actually showing is that our brain is so much more easily able to access this flow state and its neural functioning when we're in nature as opposed to in urban areas. We have such greater capacity when we're in nature. And so being able to find your happy place, where is it that you learn best? Where is it that you're able to consume information, that you're able to improve that retention? And I would argue that that place is not walking down the street in a city. Even if you've got your headphones in and you can't hear much of it, there's so much stimulus coming at you, whether it's sound, whether it's movement, that is distracting you from actually being able to absorb that information. So putting yourself in the environment where you can consume information effectively is unbelievably important. The next one is curiosity over confidence. Now, there's 3 points I'm about to touch on that throughout my kind of journey, and this is even actually pre-Bitcoin, they've helped me really start to dig into the information I'm consuming. And they help you interrogate that information to determine its validity. The first point is the inversion technique. Why could I be wrong? Now, if you ever dig into Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, they always talk about if you're going to invest in a business, it's one thing to know, why should I invest in that business? It's another thing altogether to be able to say, why shouldn't I be able to invest in that? Why shouldn't I invest in that business? And I think that when you start to look at something and you invert it, you flip the script, that deepens your understanding of that topic unbelievably. And I think as Bitcoiners, many times we get stuck where it's just like we can push the why Bitcoin, why Bitcoin, why Bitcoin. But being able to say, why shouldn't I invest in Bitcoin? What are the failures of Bitcoin is really important because it will deepen our understanding. So anytime I'm reading content, I ask myself, why could this not be true? Why is this false? And so trying to flip that, invert the subject which you're talking about, the subject matter, and look at it from a different perspective. The next one is Thinking in Bets. Now, have any of you guys read the book Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke? No, there's not a single person in here. That's amazing. So there's a lady called Annie Duke who was the world's best poker player. And she wrote a book called Thinking in Bets. And what she talks about is how poker has completely changed how she thinks about the world. Because in poker, you're playing probabilities. No single hand is a guaranteed win. As a result, you've got to play the probabilities. What is the probability that this hand is going to allow me to win? And so what she's done is taken that thinking and then pushed it out into the real world. She thinks in probabilities. Every time she's talking to someone, she's sharing an opinion. Rather than saying black or white, this is true or this is false, she says, I'm kind of like 60% confident in this. I'm 20% confident in this. And thinking in probabilities, what it does is it allows us to change our mind so much more easily. If I say to someone, I'm kind of like 90% confident in this, I'm still giving myself the ability to be wrong. And that allows me to then change my opinion, as opposed to saying, I believe this or I believe this. It becomes very hard for us if we're just saying, I believe this, to pivot. And when we're wrong, we get stuck in our opinions, we get locked in. And so Annie Duke talks a lot about when you think in probabilities, assigning probabilities to any situation, it allows you to stay flexible and open to change. And then the final one that I'll kind of quickly point on is the 5 whys. The founder of Toyota, and I can never pronounce his name, the founder of Toyota came up with this idea called the 5 whys. And this is that if you're working in the factory, you're working in the business, and you come up and you're kind of stumped on a problem. The first thing you do is you ask why. Why am I facing this problem? And you're going to get an answer. Now that's probably going to be the symptom. That's not going to be the root. So then you ask, from that answer, you ask why again. Well, why am I getting this answer? And you keep asking why, and each time you ask why, you get down another layer of the onion. And the ultimate goal is to get down to the root. And it may not be 5, it may be 7 whys, it may be 3 whys. But an example would be, if we've got a company and people are coming to me and they're saying, oh man, I just think the system is broken. We need to regulate corporations because corporations are causing a rise in prices. What they have not done is they've not interrogated. They've not looked deeper than prices are rising. Who's rising those prices? It's corporations. What they haven't asked is why are corporations rising the prices? Well, it's probably because their resource costs are going up. But why are the resource costs going up? And then eventually you find out, oh, there's a money printer at the bottom of the hole. And so I think what's really important is to question, like when we understand something, when there's a problem, to say, well, why is this problem happening? And then when we find an answer, why is that the answer? And keep digging down, keep asking why, and it helps us understand the root cause of a lot of these issues. And so to me, these 3 kind of ways to approach knowledge have profoundly impacted my ability to consume and digest information. And then the final one is kind of turning that content into knowledge. We can consume as much content as we want, but if we don't have an efficient flow for converting that content into knowledge and retaining that knowledge, it's kind of useless. And so for me, there's kind of been 2 apps that have profoundly changed my life, my knowledge. If it wasn't for these apps, I wouldn't have my book. And so the first one is one called Voice Dream Reader. Voice Dream Reader allows you to put in any PDF, any book, any website, any form of text document, and you can put it into this app and it will speak it out to you. It's in a little bit of a robot voice, but you get used to the robot voice, and then every single thing you consume is the same robot voice. And you can adjust the words per minute to the specific words per minute, like 335 words per minute, so you can find the exact speed that works for you so it engages. Because if it's too slow, you're gonna lose engagement and you're just gonna drop off. If it's too fast, you're not gonna understand it. So find that speed that works for you. So Voice Dream Reader, that's where I consume all my books for the last 7 or 8 years. The next up is something called Obsidian. And I don't know how many of you guys take notes on the content you consume, but Obsidian it's free, and it's basically a note-taking app, and it can share across whether it's your desktop, your laptop, your cell phone. You can take notes, you can structure them in ways that mimic kind of the neural pathway, the ways our brain functions. And Obsidian has profoundly, again, changed my life in the way that I store knowledge, because what I realized when I was diving down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin and how we learn is that our brain is phenomenal at piecing together abstract ideas. What it's not good at is taking those the knowledge from something that we've consumed, the details, and memorizing those things. And so what Obsidian does is when we take these notes, we store them in this app, and then we remember the overall idea of a book, and then we can go back to Obsidian, we can find the details, and we can cite them, we can reference them. And so it's helped me immeasurably. But I would say that when it comes to Obsidian, you've got to have a strict idea on how you actually take notes, because again, you can take notes into oblivion and have all the information in the world, but if you never go back and look over it, if you're not taking the notes in an effective manner, again, it's useless. And so I have kind of broken it down. Oh, it's going to go. No, where is it? Oh, there it is. I've broken it down into kind of three main steps that I approach when it comes to note taking. The first is I only take notes on what interests me. I do not take notes like chapter 1 talks about this, chapter 2 talks about this, chapter 3 talks about this. If you do that, you're probably not going to finish the book. You're going to lose interest. You're not going to be in the flow state. And so I only take notes on what truly interests me. If it doesn't interest me, I don't take a note on it. Secondly, once I've actually gone through and I've read the book and I've taken all of these notes, I go through and I bold the ones that really stood out to me and was like, that was really interesting. I go and bold those so that next time I come back to the note, I can skim all of my notes and I can see the key points that stood out to me, and I can get an idea of that book and the kind of the core details that kind of stood out to me at that time of reading. And then finally, I expand. Of those ones that I bolded, there's probably 2 or 3 that were absolutely like kind of world-ending. It changed the way that I thought about this thing. And what I tend to do on these is I expand and rewrite them into my own words. And again, you can start to think about it in the same way we think about the brain. If, as I was reading this section, it reminded me, hey, I remember I was reading a book that talked about this from a different light, what I do is when I expand, I actually link it to that other section through Obsidian. And so if I ever go back to the note, I can actually see what I was thinking about at that time. I've created a neural pathway of sorts. And so this is where Obsidian is so powerful, but you've got to have you've got to have a foundational way that we think about note-taking. And so to me, it's kind of selective notes, only write down what interests you, highlight, bold the ones that really stood out to you, and then expand. Expand on the ones that were truly kind of like groundbreaking. They reshape how you think about the world. And that, to me, is how you turn content that you've consumed into actual knowledge and changing your perspective of the world. Now, I say I've got 3 points, but I'm going to have one more anyway. This one, is it going to work? Go. There we go. Now, SYB, you guys will find out what it stands for in a second, but you don't actually have to read this, but what it highlights is there's a study that came out in 2023 that talks about how testosterone, and this isn't just in males, it's in females as well. When we have a drop in testosterone, what it does is it makes us more conformist, it makes us more in alignment with pro-social behaviors. And so when you have a society that's losing testosterone, all of a sudden we become far more susceptible to these controlling structures, these totalitarian structures. And what we're seeing in society is that basically since even the 2000s, the average 20-year-old today has the same testosterone that a 70-year-old had in 1970s. Like, that is unbelievable. We've seen an absolute drop-off in testosterone. We've seen it gone from 605 ng per deciliter down to 451 in 2015, 2016, over just a 15-year period. And I would argue that part of that is the cell phones at which we're using today, and the EMFs and the Wi-Fi and all of these electromagnetic frequencies at which we face. This one study was showing that there's a control group. There's a group that used 30 minutes of cell phone usage a day and 60 minutes. And it saw a 50% reduction in testosterone as a result of 60 minutes of cell phone usage. And then finally, what I would say is there are ways to help fix this. And so SYB stands for Sun Your Balls. And basically what this is saying, this study was done in 1939, and we have found that just irradiating the chest, getting outside and irradiating the chest, increases testosterone 120%. And this is in men and women. And if you go out and sun the genital area, 200% increase. And so I'm not necessarily like this is tongue-in-cheek, but I do it. And I would say that ultimately we should put ourselves out there, get into nature. When it comes to Bitcoin, it's so easy to go down the content consumption rabbit hole, where all we want to do is like, oh man, I want to learn about this, and I want to learn about this. And it's easy to become a hermit. I've become a hermit quite a few times in my life. And when we become a hermit and we spend a lot of time inside, we're exposed to all of these electromagnetic frequencies, and we're not getting the natural light, which is necessary for our body to be able to take in light and convert it into vitamin D, all of the various nutrients, all of the various hormones in our body. And so I would argue a lot of the health issues we have in society today essentially stem from the environment that we're creating because of technology. And so as Bitcoiners, when we start to have more capacity, when we start to have the ability to be curious, like dig into these subjects, get outside into natural light, spend time learning in nature, and it will profoundly impact your ability to retain information. And so our goal at the end is to be able to consume information like this little guy here. He's pretty amazing. And so the problem is knowledge is only as powerful as the change it creates. And so kind of wrapping up, what I really want to just highlight is this newfound wisdom to create change. We must put ourselves out there first. And so I spoke about it in Madeira a few years back, but you guys have probably heard the saying, like, we are all Satoshi. We're all Satoshi essentially just means, in my mind, that there is no marketing department for Bitcoin. There's no centralization of Bitcoin. Ultimately, Bitcoin's success falls on our shoulders. And we all have a unique perspective in how we view Bitcoin. And so I really urge you guys, and I'm sure most of you guys are educators in the room, to put yourself out there and speak your truth, and you'll resonate to a unique cohort of individuals. And so it's one thing to go out there and have the capacity for yourself. It's another thing to go take that capacity and to learn about the world around us. But it's another thing entirely to then go and share that information, because that's how we create change as a community. And so the final point that I'll just kind of wrap up on is these are kind of 4 resources out of the hundreds of books that I've read over the years. These are 4 resources that profoundly shaped how I think. The first one, The Art of Explanation. Although Ross Atkins is a BBC host, which I'm not a big fan of the BBC, the way he thinks about explanation is profound. Phenomenal book. How to Take Smart Notes really dives into like the importance of taking notes and how to take them in an efficient manner. You've then got Light, the Medicine of the Future. This obviously talks about the importance of light on our hormonal systems, our health, and then finally Deep Nutrition, like why we should think about our ancestral nutrition. And when you have more capacity, you have the ability to dive into these things. And so maybe I just wanted to kind of turn it back to you guys now and say, like, is there anything as Bitcoiners, since going down this rabbit hole, is there anything that has profoundly shaped your ability to consume knowledge? Or what is, like, if you were to summarize your process in 30 seconds, what would that process be in terms of how you consume knowledge? Or you can just ask me a question if you want to ask me a question. But I open it up to people. Yeah? All hands. Oh.
I know you said all that stuff, money, and then the tears that fall down. It's just like, why do we stop learning? Everything seems to be cyclical, and I know that from history, but what do you think that is that triggers that we must go back to control? Like, what is that? Like, why don't we just pause this? Like, do you have any ideas around that? And I love what you say about, like, toxicity and EMF and everything else, because sun, infrared, Diary of the CEO, who's got a great one on that.
Totally. Well, in the end, a government ultimately doesn't really have control over a mass of a million people, 10 million people, 100 million people. If those people were to revolt, they can't do anything. And so the only way they can command control is through propaganda, through brainwashing, through being able to consume those individuals, their time and capacity to think for themselves. And so what I was really trying to articulate through this is that when you have a society that everyone is effectively on their knees, that they're simply waking up in the morning, they're going to work, they're coming home, and they're eating, going back to bed, and they're repeat, they have no ability to question the world around them. They have no ability to lean into curiosity. And so because they're feeling this free-floating anxiety as an individual, all we want to do is rid ourselves of this free-floating anxiety. That's like number one. If you've got a thorn in your foot, you want to take out that thorn. And so these individuals, they don't know what is causing this object of anxiety. So if you have a leader that comes up and says, hey, the cause of the object of anxiety is the J word, then all of a sudden what you're going to realize is, hey, it must be these guys. And they don't have the capacity to step out and actually start reading into this. They don't have the capacity to go look at the sources, look at the citations, and figure out whether there's truth behind this, because they're working 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And so they just put their faith in the experts. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic, where these individuals that are working day in, day out, if you had anyone who basically they just wanted to figure out, like, how do I get freedom? How do we get back to normalcy? Well, all the government had to do was step up and say, trust Anthony Fauci, trust the science. People don't ever dig into the knowledge because they don't have the capacity to dig into the knowledge. Totally.
Don't know how that happened. Well, I mean, they didn't allow media in there for so long. Now they allow media.
Yeah.
It's just like they didn't allow it for a long time. And I just go like you think that it happened slowly.
Well, now I would say that we've seen the slow, since like 1971, we've seen the slow degradation of our capacity, and we've also seen the social censorship of media. And so again, as we spoke about at the very start with Mao, a threat is curiosity. The threat is knowledge. The threat is the intellectuals. And so if you silence those individuals, if the average individual who is just trying to survive is not able to think for himself, and he can't even find sources that kind of speak up against the establishment, it's very hard for those individuals to escape this kind of mob mentality. All they want is to pull the thorn out of their toe. And so if they're told this is your object of anxiety, then that's when you get this mob mentality. But you need this cohesion. Mm-hmm. Well, and like, you know what? There's an example with Mao where at a point there was this massive famine, and people were dying left, right, and center. People were struggling. Like, all they could do is just think about, like, how do I get food on the table? And so what Mao ended up saying, well, the reason why you are hungry is not because of him. It's actually because the birds are coming down and they're pecking the seeds out of the soil. And so what happened? The people went and killed millions and millions of birds because they didn't have the capacity to think for themselves. There's no books telling them this stuff. And so all of a sudden you just get this mob mentality where people completely drop their irrationality or their rationality, and they're willing to lean in, drop their morals, drop their values. And I think the other challenging thing is we're social beings. We want to conform. And so when you see 100 of your friends doing the same thing, it's very hard for you to step out of that circle and say, that makes zero sense. I'm not doing that. And that's what's unique about Bitcoin. You look at the Myers-Briggs breakdown of Bitcoiners, and we are the 1%, the 5% of the world, yet we make up the majority of Bitcoiners. So we have a tendency to actually think for ourselves, to go against the grain, but that's not normal. Yeah.
Okay, and it sounds like we're getting into territory which could be a breakout discussion as well. So we've just gone up to our 30 minutes. I can see there's a few. If you still have questions, just raise your hand. We've got a couple of questions. So Seb, you want to maybe spot these people and see if they want to have conversations on the side? I'm sorry, I have to push this through. But Seb, thank you so much for showing us insights into the rabbit hole and then the way of finding our way back out to the rabbit hole so we can sun our balls.